Welcome to Writer's Life, an ongoing conversation with writers, authors, and folks in the publishing industry. I'm your host, Marvel Harrison, Publishing Director, Mimbres Press of Western New Mexico University. It's a pleasure to share a conversation today with Arturo. He is a newly published author who was schooled on the U.S.-Mexico border in the farming town of Somerton, Arizona, as well as the fishing town of El Golfo de Santa Clara, Mexico. He has worked in human rights, providing aid to people who lost loved ones crossing the border. His first book is Nostalgias of November. Welcome to Writer's Life, Arturo.
Good morning. Thank you for having me. I appreciate your time and everybody's time in the audience.
Well, welcome also to being a published author. Mimbres Press is proud to be the home of your first book, and it's our first book that is in both English and Spanish. So congratulations and my gratitude. Arturo, how did you start writing? You came from this interesting history of being raised across the border and being involved in two different cultures, societies, worlds. And how did your history bring you to writing?
Okay, I think my personal history and my family history plays into it immensely. Growing up and still, my dad was always a lover of literature and story and music. That's how we connected. Also, my grandma, she had old 78s. She would sing old songs from 100 years ago and she would tell us stories, and you could see it. And that was my hope with the book, is bringing my grandparents and my dad and my mom, the people around me, into the writing. And I think my goal with the writing is to bring these stories in. Perhaps they weren't written down on paper, right? It was maybe a story I heard from my grandfather who fished in El Golfo in Mexico, and bringing that to life in a different way, in a new context, in a modern context. And I also just remember, like, growing up, we would go to thrift stores, we would buy a bunch of books. My dad would buy us old books, hundreds of books around the house, always being able to pick one up. And I think that came into it. And also, too, it was difficult for me to write. Growing up, my dad would edit my essays and my stories, and with red marker, and like, what's this? This is a passive voice. And I also think loving the craft of it came into it, because I wanted to show myself that, I could get better at something if I put my mind to it. I think that's what came into it.
Excuse me, was your dad a writer also?
He studied English. He worked in various nonprofits, here on the border too. But just a lover, like, of story. And I think that's how we connected. We would share a book, like, have you read this author? Have you read this Steinbeck book? And I think that relationship was founded on a lot of those conversations.
And those hundreds of books that were in your home, scattered about as you describe, were they in English, in Spanish, both?
So both, mostly in English. Growing up on this side of the border, it's really hard to find Spanish or bilingual books, which is something that it's hard to probably, but yeah, mostly English. I went to public school here in Yuma in Somerton, Arizona. So, but always, my favorite books, though, were always like Latin American writers, Marquez, but they were translated into English, so I would read them in English.
Have you gone back and read any of those favorite authors in their native tongue?
Yeah, so Don Quixote, like a couple years ago, I got for Christmas, like, Don Quixote in the original Spanish, and I was like, okay, this is where it's at.
You know, there are so few bilingual books, period. And so I think that's particularly wonderful. We started out with your book and your poetry in English and then made that transition. And I'm so appreciative of you taking the time and effort to do that. And I think it's a real gift to the publishing world to be able to have bilingual uh, end products and books for people to be able to cherish.
I think so too. I think growing up, those very few instances that I would find bilingual books, it was like a treasure because it's. I think when we speak to others, it's a way of saying like, oh, he speaks like us, she speaks like me. They are like me, right? So if I find a book that is bilingual, like most everyone in my family is, it's as if I'm saying, I know this person, I know this book because we're able to connect in this way. And I think that's a beautiful thing. And I'm appreciative of the press, Mimbres Press, for that, for allowing me to express myself in that way.
I think what you say is so true. As much as we're a world attempting to celebrate differences, I think there's something about embracing sameness and having a reflection of our identity and who we are in the world with people like us. And yet, I think the truer and more grounded we are in that, the more able we're able to outreach to many different groups and languages. And I really believe that people with multiple languages really have superpowers. And I like in elementary schools when I see, you know, the celebration of learning another language and it being created as a superpower. It's like it takes you to a whole nother world.
Yeah, and it's a beautiful thing. And that's something that I'm seeing now more and more being accepted. Um, yeah, and before, I think a lot of the Chicano communities were perhaps, and you even see it here, like right on the border. A lot of people, probably before, they would stick mostly with English. You know, we're in a new country, but I think carrying that part of you moving forward is a beautiful thing because you're able to connect with others in different ways.
Well, and speaking of the border, your father had worked in a lot of nonprofits along the border, and you have expressed, and your writing expresses deep concern and awareness and observation of border and border issues. Um, Tell me, or share with us, if you would, about your human rights activism, your awarenesses. When and how did that occur in your life, and how has that laid an imprint in your writing?
Okay, I think it is something I've observed people not necessarily do it for a paycheck, right? Like doing nonprofit or human rights work. But I think since I was a little kid, I would see the people around me um, always helping others. I remember a specific story that was sort of a turning point in my life. I think I was maybe 12, 13 years old. And I was sitting with my grandpa. He was still alive. He would smoke cigars and walk barefoot. And I remember he was sitting on his chair and that's what he was doing. And we were just looking at the road. It was a nice spring day. Um, and there was a man walking on the street and he fainted out of nowhere. And I remember at that point, I was sort of scared. Like I didn't know how to react. I've never seen somebody have a medical issue like that one-on-one. And I remember that people were looking, no one was doing anything. And my grandpa, he stood up, he put out a cigar, he walked over, and we took the man to the clinic. And I remember it was a simple action of what needed to be done. So I sort of think that sort of inspired me. Like if I see something that I could do in one way to help another person, I think that's the right thing to do. And sort of that continued into the type of work that I wanted to do and the type of work that I wanted to write about. If I could write a line that is true, if I could write a line that perhaps speaks to the reality of violence on the border, of what's around me, but also the beauty in doing what I think is the right thing, what I think is morally right. I think that's my goal in writing, and also too in my interaction with people around me.
There's so many different ways to contribute, right?
Mhm.
And you're finding your voice, both in the written word in two different languages. And sounds like your grandfather was a really wonderful person who just, as you described, calmly just took care of what needed to be taken care of, in spite of so many other people around just ignoring it all. I think sometimes it's harder for us to stand up when there's lots of people who are not. And so I applaud the history of your grandfather, and, really want to support and celebrate who you are in your writing, especially with Mimbres Press. I appreciate you very much.
Thank you so much. And my family, thanks everyone here too. And likewise, we appreciate everything.
Well, thanks to our board member, Stella Pope Duarte, who, wonderfully connected us with your work and you. And, we're going to have a couple of audiobooks, and I think hearing your poetry in your voice is going to be very wonderful for people. And your willingness to participate with us is greatly appreciated. So thank you.
Likewise, the feeling is mutual. And yeah, I think it's beautiful how things happen. And I'd like to say something about Miss Pope Duarte too, if I could.
Please.
Mhm. When I was a student at Arizona State University, I think I was 18, 19 years old, and I was trying to write. It was when I was getting serious about, like, oh, I want to write the great Chicano American novel, Mexican American novel. And but I was so green. I remember, like, my skills weren't there. I didn't know how to put what I was learning into practice. And I sent an email on the off chance that she would respond. We were talking about her book, Let Their Spirits Dance, in one of our classes. And she responded to me, and it was sort of, I won the lottery at that point. It gave me encouragement to continue writing. And now, after all these years, we've reconnected in this way through these poems and through Mimbres Press. And I think it's just a beautiful thing of that time that has passed, and what that point of encouragement, what it has contributed in my life. And I'll be eternally grateful for her for that.
I think it speaks to that we should never, as individuals, underestimate that a moment of spirit can last a lifetime. It was a moment in time where she took the outreach, and Stella's such a lovely woman in that regard, and so generous with her scope of talent. And, it was a moment that, like you said, put you on a very different trajectory. And lucky us, we've all ended up with a beautiful book of poetry. So, it's been a joy to speak with you today, Arturo, and thanks to everyone who has joined us. I'm Marvel Harrison, and from all of us at Mimbres Press, may your day be sparked with curiosity and wonder. See you again on the next Writer's Life.